Transitional justice in Morocco, and it includes three main interventions. The first by Mr. Mohamed Saadi, and the third one by Said Haji, and the third one by Mr. Chafik Abdelghani. Now let me give the floor to Mr. Ahmed Idali to preside the session. Ladies and gentlemen, let's resume this session, and it is about the transition justice in Morocco, memory and history. So collective memory is an important issue or element for the creation of the identity, and also ensure the relationships within the community, because it builds collective memory, and this is why we have asked certain questions. How can we serve or work just the building of the memory? And how can we overcome the diversions in terms of use of memory? And how can we just protect memory from ideology? So to deal with these different issues, so we have three presenters who will discuss the issues about memory and history. So the first one is Mr. Mohamed Saadi. He is Professor of Political Science and Human Rights at Mohamed Premier University in Oujda, Morocco. So the title of his presentation, so the movement and painful collective memory recognition as a prelude to reconciliation with the wounds of the past. Thank you, Mr. President, and also thank you for CARAP for the invitation to participate in this conference dealing with a very important issue in which we invite the past in the present to build the future. So the topic is about the Reef movement, which started with the event of the killing of a fish seller, and which has different repercussions in a new context in Morocco, which we just asked the question about transitional justice in a new aspect. So it is within a movement of protest unprecedented, and a boycott just that built the identity of the citizens, and it built new dynamics and new means of protests. For example, the ultras is the first time in the history of Morocco. So it's for the first time, instead of watching football, so just generally people, they watch what happens in the tiers of the stadium and the songs that are made, and with the slogan of they oppressed me, and which is included, or the Lamuni, which is included now in Wikipedia. So we have a new just means of protest and movement, and peaceful movements in which they try to avoid the oppression of the state. And so the change can be just at low cost, and the boycott was very successful. So the Reef movement started in the northern area of Morocco, in some small cities and towns, and then its repercussions were huge in Morocco, and Morocco witnessed the biggest number of protests, and the biggest protests in Morocco for 8 months in a continuous way. You have continuous protests in the cities and the main towns, and and there was just a very important movement despite the lack of media coverage. We have also the participation of the diaspora in Madrid, in Belgium, in Brussels, and also in many European cities. So all this created a new movement, a new force with the political detainees now, and which have been sentenced to 20 years of prison. So the thesis that we are making here is that the economic marginalization is not only necessary or the only variable that we should take into consideration for the movement, and it is also related to history and also the roots of history. There is a willingness or a will to change, and here we can ask the main question: how can we just design, or let's say establish, the culture of recognition? So this should be given importance. So people want to be recognized. We don't want apology. So because we are fed up with this culture of apology, but it's important that people will just get a recognition about their way of lives, about their individual values in society. And this is a kind of the paradigm of recognition and trying to understand the youth who are involved in this movement and why they are just and this is related to the collective memory. And as you can see the picture of now what we call the milling of Mohsen Takrit, and here we see a presence in the movement of Al-Harak, and then we have a new just flags just which appeared in the movement, the flag of the countryside or the Reef region, which appeared in the 1920s, and now it is also the Amazigh or the Berber flag that is also used in Algeria. And we have the picture of the leader of the Reef movement and the Republic of Reef, Mr. El-Khattabi, who died just in exile in Cairo in 1960s, and he did not return at all. And all this, I mean, pushed the youth of Reef. And also we have the presence of women, and the icon of the movement was a very simple young man who was able to collect just a large number of people, and also his videos reaches a huge amount of audiences. More than just in 15 minutes he managed a large number of live video sequence. He had his 40 years of age, and he didn't get even his secondary school diploma. And we can see the picture of Al-Harak, in which summarizes all the kind of movement in the face of Nasser Zafzafi, the leader of this movement. And generally we have also a kind of the use of graffitis, and in which they mention I am history and history doesn't die. So this kind of new Hirak or movement just set in new aspects and asked new questions about reconciliation, and also given value to the symbols of Morocco and the charismatic figures such as Al-Khattabi. The youth are just making a kind of categorization or a new register, and they just move, or let's say transfer from parents to children. So it's again the kind of the way the oppression against the Reef people in the 1930s, in which the government tried and made a massacre in the Reef region. At the first it was a kind of and also the manual fight or battle, so in which the Reef inhabitants they defeated the Spanish, and they managed to make a kind of an emirate or a kind of a republic with a flag and also a national anthem. So that is considered just similar to the anthem of Morocco, of Lebanon today, and so then this kind of power has been just eradicated with the help of the French, and then its leader has been exiled to Cairo, and his body was buried in the 1960s in the Cairo, and he refused to return back to Morocco without the setting of a democratic constitution. And most of the ministers, they were exiled in many regions in Morocco, and they were only allowed to give religious lessons in the mosques. So the other narrative is in 1958, right after independence. So the Moroccan government, it somehow eradicated or just committed a massacre in the region in 1958 during the Bread Revolt, and so for about 40 people died in that kind of action, and then we make a kind of a statue in memory of those who died, made by the government. So after that, we talk about the Reef movement, which led to the trial of many young people, and some of them were sentenced to 20 years of prison. So people, just the youth, think that there is an exclusion of the history of the region. So this is the headquarters of the old, let's say, republic. And now it is left abandoned, as you can see. It is a monument, but that is abandoned by the government. In addition to this kind of historical shock, so there was just the event of the burning of 5 youth or 5 young people in the region. Just all this movement opened the doors to ask the question about reconciliation or historical reconciliation in the region, and in a new way in which there is just given, let's say, importance and to the most important issues. There is a shared feeling that there is usually a kind of oppression against the history of the region, and they usually try to just eradicate or, let's say, erase the memory. But each time they do that, we get more convinced and more, let's say, aware of its importance and our role in restoring the histories. So nobody just in the past tried to just raise the flag, but many of the desks in schools that have pictures of this flag, and despite any attempt to just eradicate the history, so we just protect the flag and the history by our hearts. So usually there is a kind of defamation or a kind of phobia from the Reef region. So the people just from the region, they are just depicted as separatists, as just as racist, as smugglers, as intruders, as Shia, and just outlandish, and also as parasites. Apart from the other, descriptions that are used, and just the movement, or the Harak, reposted in this way. So each time you ask for just your economic rights, if you ask for, let's say, for the building of a university or a hospital to deal with cancer diseases, so they asked for a university and just cancer, just a hospital, in order to preserve the history and also to to treat the people who got, let's say, attacked chemically by the Spanish. So there is people there, they just insist on the fact of not forgetting, just we will never forget that, but this is what they are saying. So and the Hirak succeeded in the test of fighting against forgetfulness and the attempts of the government to steal their collective memories. So after fighting just in hidden way, so now they have their faces just now they fight just without any cover, and they are fighting based on their awareness and in a peaceful way. It's a kind of, let's say, popular nationalism that sometimes leads to ethnic racism. For example, when they use the reef spirit or the clean spirit, we don't share the same genes, and also we have the picture, no prison would scare me, I am from the reef and everybody knows me. So the oppression and the kind of shocks that the region, in terms of, let's say, attacks against its origins, created a kind of everlasting feeling of oppression. And also there is a recall for the flag of the reap, and then recall of the words of Abdelkarim Khattabi, who is the charismatic figure of the region. Usually Muhammad Abdelkarim al-Tabib also, there is a presence of this figure just representing faithfulness to the soul of ancestors. So some of the youth say that the spirit of Mr. Khattabi, who protects us against oppression, and he's the wall against which we behind which we hide wherever there is attacks. So we just get inspired from his words and from his ideas. So there is a kind of, let's say, addiction to the discourse of victimization and victims. So the reef collective memory is always marked by this kind of discourse. This is why most of the youth, they say, we are not living, we are not dead, but we are buried alive. So the memory of the reef just tells us that the youth are imprisoned to a collective memory that do not want to let them free, just like a butterfly which is trying to get liberated, but the weight of the stone doesn't let it just on its way. So generally, the kingdom, the king, and also the Reconciliation Commission trying to. But as a paradox, so the only session that was organized just at night there took place in the Reef region. So they set a session in which people, they just participated, and recommendations were taken into consideration as a result of this. So they did not also consider Abdel al-Khattabi and ask to bring his body from, let's say, from Egypt. So when we deal with the collective memory, it's impossible, I conclude that it's impossible to make a historical reconciliation with the regions only through the recognition and also a kind of recognition of the memory. And even at, let's say, a symbolic way, like building, for example, a statue, or just declaring the flag as the flag for the region, like what's happening in Germany or in Spain, for example, that won't cost much for the government, and all these decisions or measures can change lives. But they talk about the meeting in the Rif region. It took just place at night or at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So the young people, they are not convinced that there was a real reconciliation with the Rif. What kind of, this is the slogan we have here, which reconciliation are talking about when the Rif is still bleeding? So it is related to the virtue of courage. And so also, so the last point, the young people or the youth, they just drew the picture of Guernica of Picasso, and they put it in the large square, and for them they are saying that there is a very sensitive, let's say, spirit, and they want to just reach peace and recovery, but they are unable to do that. So what happened today is liberation of speech, to just express themselves on the the kind of oppression that happened to them. So the Hirak is a new opportunity that can be seized by the Moroccan government in order to just solve the problem and put an end to this crisis. So what we need is that recognition and some courage, just to send a message for recognition, cultural recognition, and just giving back the dignity to the youth, so they can find themselves and their identities, and then they can reach their dignity in a country that can accommodate all its participants or its people. Thank you, Mr. Mohammed. So what he covered is mainly about the reasons for just the protests, and he mentioned just an explanation concerning, let's say, the relationship of the Rif youth with the people.
احتجاج يبدو رفضا لاحتقار الذات الريفية وصراعا من أجل الاعتراف. I
think protest is due to the fact that El-Hirak has not been recognized, and so there is this feeling of unfairness, which may perhaps explain that feelings of despise may entice other people to express and to expose those feelings. The fact of being invisible makes things worse. Professor Mohammed shows how Nasser Zebzefi and his comrades have contributed to the representations of memory outside what was experienced. And perhaps here there is investment in symbols in order to bring some animation, so to speak, to memory. The second speaker is professor in Fas in the University of Sidi, Mohamed Abdellah. He will talk to us about the body of equality and fairness. You have the floor, Mr. Said.
شكرا سيد رئيس مرحبا بالحضور الكريم. شكرا للمركز العربي
Thanks to Carib for this invitation. As you could see, the title of my presentation is With the Respect to the historical writing as one way of providing reparation. And here, as you can see, I focused on ways of compensation for the wrong done and the efficiency of this mechanism with respect to its efficiency on people. So this is not only a measure undertaken by the state, but rather what is important to see here is to see the outcomes of this transitional justice through the tool of reparation. This was one of the first experiences in Arab region, and it started from the fact that Morocco, from 1956 to 1999, the year of the death of the former king. As you can see, this was a period of a series of violations. Some of them are related to the period 56-61, related to the conflict between the different political parties in Morocco on power positions in post-independence period, and then you have the 60s and 70s, where the state was responsible for these violations. Here I'm going to focus on 56 to 61 period, because this period in all was poorly represented in all work on reparation and compensation. The parties concerned by violations were parties that had extensions in political parties, and they were close to the state, and many people think that the historical distance is perhaps behind the poor interest of the authority in this period. In all cases, this authority had seen 682,000 cases, but it only has taken into account about 1,000 cases. And the files submitted, generally speaking, did not concern or concerned cases of gross or grave violations with enforced disappearance. And this explains the challenge that this authority had to face. I would focus on the historical writing as a mechanism for reparation. Many families of victims, despite their receiving financial compensation and despite the recognition of the fact that their members were victim to violations, and despite the fact that many of them died, so despite all of these financial compensations and recognition that the members of their families were victims, these mechanisms have not been, the Commission has not recognized some realities that would precisely give them full recognition. It is possible for the Commission to create mechanisms to adopt some of the narratives that take a formal dimensional aspect and that would be fair according to the families of the victims. So we have problems with those pending issues because the answers of the Commission were not satisfactory for the families of the victims, and they were not convincing, because they say that financial compensation is important, equity, equality is important, but the writing of history
والأقدر على
for them
خدمة
is
الذاكرة
the
الجماعية.
most important because this is the most empowering for their memory. And here I'm going to focus precisely on Salam Ahmed Idali, who was kidnapped from Tetouan in 1956.
بعد حوالي 40 سنة
After
سيتم العثور على
40
رفاته في
years,
مدينة
his
غفسي
corpus
يعني
was
في
found in Rafsai
شمال شرقي
city,
المغرب
northeast
وعائلته
Morocco.
يعني
And
تتبعت
his
ملفه
family
على مدى
have
عقود
followed his
وعبد
case
السلام أحمد طاود كان معروفا
for
بمجموعة من
decades and
المواقف
decades, and he was known for his
المعارضة لأحد الأحزاب السياسية
opposing positions to the political party of independence. It was against ex-Liban convention that gave the independence of Morocco, and these positions were extremely embarrassing for some political parties, or even some state parties, as you could be seen from the investigation conducted by the Commission. The problem is, how can the mechanisms of the Commission find solutions that are away from any confusion that could come out from the investigation of these rights? As we know, the only source here is memory. And we all know the dangers that may be attached to memory as a source of the only source of truth. And how can we reach a moral compensation on the basis of these testimonies? And then, what is the position of the historian from this process? Are there anything inside the Commission
أو آلية التمييز بين الحقيقة التاريخية والحقيقة السياسية ثم الإشكالية الجوهرية هل يمنع ارتباط معطيات معينة بمرحلة صراع سياسي بكتابة تاريخ منصف للمظلومين
make sure that the history is written in a way that is fair and that redresses the wrong done to the victims and to their families.
الانتهاكات التي تعرض لها الضحايا
especially that violations were under what we call political conflict. And this somehow puts on an equal footing both the victims and the wrongdoers. I wanted to trace things back to the origin of this problem in order to find the solution between the historical writing of this and as you can see, most of the definitions of this
الذي يقول أن العدالة الانتقالية تشمل
transitional justice as provided by the United Nations
التي يبذلها المجتمع
are given by the gentleman.
تجاوز تركة الماضي الواسعة النطاق. إذن هنا الماضي يعني إحالة هنا بعد تاريخي. هناك أيضا تعريف آخر للمركز
historical dimension in the definition of the UN.
بينما ما جاء فيه أنها تكييف للعدالة على النحو الذي يلائم
adaptation of justice in a way that is compatible with societies that are undergoing special experiences, and whether transformations take place all of a sudden or over decades. Once again, you can say that there is a historical extension for the history of violations. So the historical dimension in these definitions requires the adoption of the historical methodology to identify the type of violations and their context. So the historical writing is one of the most important mechanisms to identify violations and reparation for those violations.
فيجب هنا استحضار مجموعة من الحيثيات واستحضار السياق
We need, therefore, to proceed to serious fact-finding and investigation to make sure that sources and people concerned are the right sources and people. And this is the work conducted by historians, as every time historical distance is required for those historians to conduct their investigation. The legitimacy of this debate is due to the concern of accurate, writing accurate history. So you can see here they have no interest in suing, and having any criminal suing for the executioners. They don't even look for apologies. They just want to document what happened to serve national memory. So here we're talking about historical form of writing. The period we're talking about, 56-61, is a period that witnessed strong opposition between the party of independence, and there was also another class that was a proponent of colonization because it wanted to preserve its interests, and we wanted, therefore, to give as close a picture to objectivity as possible, to see to what extent the claims lifted by the family of Ahmed Salam were true. We focused on some of the writings of Ahmed Salam, where he explained his position against some parties, expressly, I would say, the Party of Independence. And there were confrontations and conflicts that led to enforced disappearance, torture, and assassination. First, and in addition to focusing on this period, you can see that the methodology of the Commission was as follows. It organized hearing sessions before it expressed its conviction as regards the file submitted to its attention.
الذي وقع في حالة عبد السلام طود أننا أمام نتائج أو قناعتين مختلفتين.
There were two different points of view. On the one hand, the family, and it is based on different investigations, and on the other hand, the point of view of the Commission. We made a comparison between the two points of view. Among what was mentioned for the family, the unveiling of the names of the perpetrators is still impossible, despite it is possible, perhaps even necessary, to complete the operation of reconciliation. If there was genuine will for that, then information is there and sources are known. The state, as responsible for the security of its citizens, and Al-Istiqlal Party, because it is responsible for what happened. So there is that direct accusation of the party of independence. Generally speaking, the conclusions of the Commission refer the conflict in this period to contradictory conceptions of independence and national unity, and the completion of independence from colonization and the building of modern state in Morocco. So it is as if the Commission here is allocating responsibility equally both to the family and family members and to the state. But does this difference in point of view a justification to commit gross violations of human rights?
إلى أن أغلب ضحايا هذه الانتهاكات كانوا ينتمون إلى حزب الشورى والاستقلال. لاحظوا هنا نوعا من التماهي مع خلاصات العائلة، أن عبد السلام الطاود كان ينتمي إلى حزب الشورى والاستقلال، كانوا ينتمون إلى حزب الشورى والاستقلال أو الجماعات السرية المسلحة المعارضة لاتفاقية إكسليبان، والتي رفضت حسب هيئة الإنصاف والمصالحة الذوبان في مجموعات أخرى عرف عنها علاقتها الوثيقة مع حزب الاستقلال بمختلف تياراته آنذاك ومع مركز قرار الدولة المغربية الناشئة. إذن هيئة الإنصاف والمصالحة الفرق هنا هو أن العائلة تتهم مباشرة حزب الاستقلال، بينما الهيئة تتهم جماعات مقربة من حزب الاستقلال. إذن هنا يطرح السؤال: من لديه الآليات المنهجية للوصول إلى الحقيقة التاريخية، على اعتبار أن هناك العائلة تعتبر بأن ما تقوله أو ما توصلت إليه الإنصاف والمصالحة هو حقيقة سياسية، لأنها تريد أن تجنب حزب الاستقلال الوقوع في الحرج الاعتراف بمرتكبته. العائلة عائلة الطود يعني أو هيئة الإنصاف والمصالحة تقول بأن، أو العكس، يعني عائلة الطود تقول بأن الحقيقة التاريخية هي أن حزب الاستقلال مسؤول عن هذه المسألة.
So responsible for this. So in the eyes of the family, so the versions of the conclusions, so they think that, I mean, the conclusions, they will equate between the executioners and the victims. So reconciliation was absent because they know that the executioner is known and he is not ready for reconciliation. So they were only asking for just reconciliation and recognition. So the commission, in its just explanation, so it was difficult, let's say, to recognize, and the nomination of and mentioning the names of people, it will create a new phase of conflict. So at the same time, they emphasize the role of historians because they have the methodology to reach objectively, let's say, or objective conclusions. So the commission is somehow throwing the burning ball to the historians. And here we need to ask the question if the commission is not the framework to write just with the historians. So in which framework can we just write, let's say, what happened and the roots of the problem? So this is maybe, or this could have been maybe the fact that the authority or the commission, so they just suggested the inclusion of the name of truth or the concept of truth in the name of the commission, and the commission just made, let's say, the excuses that the truth is relative and there are different types of truth and we cannot reach, let's say, truth 100%. That's why they just they refer to justice and reconciliation with reference to the Tunisian experience, despite that the Tunisian experience is referred to as the truth and dignity, that but in its basic law there is no word that is relating to, let's say, this leads us to the concern that there is no the word history in its basic law. So this is why there is this concern with the history. So I won't just dive into the relationship between memory and history, just conversions. Let me just move now to conclusions. So the conclusion that I managed to reach, just the mechanisms of transitional justice are mainly targeted towards to just shed light on certain periods of some country, of the history of some countries, and if the truth is revealed or unveiled, whether we are talking about executioners or victims. So this process is the one which leads to, let's say, justice and reconciliatory justice that is better and more efficient than legal justice. So writing history is also important and unveiling truth, because the data that are used are data that are collected from the parties in the conflict, and just dealing with the data just should be perceived in a relative way. That's why historians are just better qualified to deal with the data in objective way, which serves the process of the transitional justice. So historical writing is a mechanism, a long-term mechanism for reparation, and it can be a solid basis for ensuring transitional justice. While listening to the intervention of Mr. Said, I had two questions in my mind about the relationship, complex relationship between truth, history, memory, and reparation. So is that a truth, or is it possible just to reach the truth through a kind of epistemological, let's say, a process? And here we are talking about the historical truth through somehow reaching a reconciliatory process, or just being just restricted to reparation. But just reconciliation, forgiveness requires just two horizons, or which are somehow go in parallel. So economic, so there must be a kind of economic policy that can repair just the oppression or marginalization, and also there must be a kind of academic duty when writing history. So the third participant in this session is Mr. Abdelghani Chafik. He is professor of sociology in Tofail University in Morocco. So the title of his paper is Equity and Reconciliation, Reconstructing the Memory of Ashes and Bullets in Morocco, and then finish the process of transitional justice. So we are looking forward to what is unfinished in the Moroccan experience. Thanks for CAREP for the work done and this initiative, and I would like also to thank the participants. So the title of my intervention is Reconciliation, and also just gathering, and finish it, just experience of transitional justice process. The paper does not just want to summarize the achievements of this experience that was just considered as a leading experience in the Arab country, but based on my paper, I try to focus on what is not done in this experience, and then just it will ask some questions. So to what extent the Commission reached its objectives, and then second, just the reparation mechanism is used, just some symbolic procedures that are limited, which do not meet the expectations of implementing justice. And also at another level, can we just reach forgiveness without the total unveiling of truth and recognition? And finally, how can we reach transitional justice without political reforms and legal reforms which limit the domination of the government bodies or the state institutions. So here we focus on that the process of reconciliation has been governed by certain political reconciliations and agreements which lead to the minimum of losses, to transfer of authority or power, so which led to the minimum level of expectations. So the political aspect overcome, or let's say the humanitarian or the human rights aspect. So here we are dealing with two different times, so what is before the pre and the post, and in an experience like the Moroccan experience, we did not witness a change in power or in the political system, and this creates a kind of conflict. So I will not stop the political context that were mentioned by Mr. Said, but what is important to know here is that just once after colonization, so the politicians were in a kind of just conflict about in the change in power, and so we had the kingdom with the historical legitimacy and some political parties which represent the national movement parties during colonization, before and after. And this kind of, let's say, conflict led to just a kind of gap between the kingdom and the parties, and it increased the number of detentions on the side of the leaders of the political parties, and also and he was accused, or many allegations were made by many left parties, and this period has witnessed a kind of just traditional structure in which the old agencies of the Makhzen, which were just trying to oppress all those who are opposing to the kingdom institution and authority, and those institutions, they were a kind of an obstacle to the expansion of the opposing parties, and this led to a kind of just violations of human rights, and in this way the political regime somehow weakened the opposition, and towards the beginning of the 90s the whole world witnessed changes like, for example, the fall of the USSR and Berlin Wall, and also the fall of the big ideologies, and these changes somehow affected or had an impact on the political regime. So somehow we witnessed some political reconciliations, and there is a kind of inclusion of parties such as trade unions and political parties. By the end of the 1990s, Morocco witnessed a very critical moment in terms of its, so we'll have the death of the old king, and then we just moved to the power moved to his son, but before that the kingdom just institution started just discussions with the left parties, and then these discussions just led to a kind of political reconciliation or agreement, which led to the government of
يعني حكومة التناوب التوافقي، وسيؤدي الأمر بطبيعة الحال إلى فرز الكثير من المؤسسات التي تعنى بالدفاع عن حقوق الإنسان. فكان سنة 2004 أن ظهرت تجربة الإنصاف والمصالحة. اعتبرت بطبيعة الحال هذه تجربة فارقة كما قلت في السابق، بطبيعة الحال ورائدة إلى جانب تجربة تونسية، لكن ملامح يعني أهمية أو تفرد هذه التجربة حسب الكثير من الذين تتبعوا مسارها هي أنها صدرت عن نظام سياسي كان جزءا من ماض أليم بطبيعة الحال وبادر بنفسه إلى الإقدام على مبادرة كهذه بحيث أنه انخرط بالإضافة إلى قوى سياسية في مبادرة هامة لدرء التوترات بطبيعة الحال والحيلولة دون وقوعها في المستقبل. لكن الظاهر أن ما أكسب هذه مبادرة المصالحة أهمية كذلك وما عرفته العديد من التجارب من فشل ذريع سواء في سريلانكا أو هايتي أو مجموعة من البلدان. وعلى العموم فإن رهان هذه المصالحة كان يتجه صوبا بطبيعة الحال السعي إلى تجاوز الاحتقان السياسي عكس الكثير من البلدان الإفريقية التي كانت الملاحقة الجنائية لمرتكبي الإبادة الجماعية هي الشرط الملازم أو الدافع الضروري لكل مصالحة كما في حالة رواندا وإفريقيا الوسطى. إذن على العموم ميزة هذه المبادرة كما قلت أنها صدرت عن أطراف شكلت بكيفية أو بأخرى طرفا فاعلا في ولكن مصدر قوتها كذلك شكل مصدر ضعفها نظرا لأنه كان يصعب بطبيعة الحال على هذه القوى التي شكلت جزءا من الماضي الأليم أن تحاسب نفسها بنفسها. إذا طرحت إشكالية مدى أهمية هذه الأطراف بطبيعة الحال أهميتها في الانخراط بمثل هذه المبادرات. بالإضافة إلى ذلك eligibility المدة التي تناولتها تجربة الإنصاف والمصالحة مثلت مدة طويلة إلى حد كبير وبالتالي هذا الأمر طرح إشكالا عميقا فيما يتعلق بقضية جبر الضرر وقضية الكشف عن الحقيقة. وفي هذا النقطة بدا واضحا أن الكثير من الحالات التي اتسمت بعنفها وبقسوتها لم تتم معالجتها من طرف هيئة الحقيقة والإنصاف. الكثير من الباحثين يعتقدون أنه بالرغم من مقامة هذه الهيئة فإن مبادراتها ظلت محدودة في حل الكثير من القضايا التي تضمنها تقريرها الختامي خاصة ما يرتبط بكشف الحقيقة وهذا هو قطب الراحة في هذه التجربة أو في المنزلقات التي سقطت فيها هذه التجربة. لذلك عندما نتتبع تجربة هيئة الحقيقة أو الإنصاف أو المصالحة والإنصاف نكتشف أنها غيبت الحقيقة لحساب الإنصاف والمصالحة على الرغم من أن عملية الكشف وجعل الحقيقة في ملك الجميع
unveiling the truth and making it the property of everybody is one of the sine qua non conditions for truth and fact-finding commissions. So, indeed, it linked the necessity of assigning individual responsibilities and accountability of authors or perpetrators and avoiding resentment and revenge on the other side. Therefore, many of the cases that required a lot of accountability were left behind and hidden under this slogan. So this reconciliation, with all its obstacles, did not reach up to pardon, when pardon is a key component of recognition of the perpetrators, because recognition of the perpetrators would have represented a cleansing or purge in front of the victim that may have led this latter, meaning the victim, a position higher than that of the author of the crime or violation. Recognition of the victims also would have led this experience to the possibility of going beyond the historical wound, and therefore recognition and asking for forgiveness were key for this process to take place. Now, these hearing sessions were also characterized by a number of failures because they were conducted on a selective basis. Many of the pitfalls therefore trace back to the long period covered by this commission.
فإن هذا التعامل الانتقائي
Therefore, this
وضع بطبيعة
selective
الحال الكثير
process
من التجارب أو حد إن شئنا من فعالية
put
هذه
limitations to the
التجربة
efficiency of this
وأيضا
experience
حد من كل إمكانية أيضا
and to the
مستقبلا
possibility in the future
يعني الوقوع
of
في منزلقات عنف سياسي جديد.
conducting
إذن ما يجعل
any
التركيز على هذا
research that may lead
المعطى
to
مهم
political
جدا
violence.
لأنه أيضا كان سيشكل مدخلا للاعتراف.
This represented
وهنا
a good
أشدد كثيرا على
entry for
نفس
recognition.
المفهوم
There I would
الذي
like to insist on
استعمله
the
أكسل هونيت عندما يحدد
principle
الاعتراف
and definition
بكونه
adopted
أو
by
يحدد
Axel Honneth.
مكونات الاعتراف انطلاقا من ثلاث مقومات
when
أساسية.
he
أولا
defined recognition
ثم
on the basis
التضامن
of three
والحق.
principles:
ويهمنا ربما
love,
في هذه التجربة
solidarity,
المكونين
and then
الأخيرين.
truth. And we are concerned here by the last two components.
مكن بطبيعة الحال
This
يعني
experience
إجراء
made it
مصالحة
possible
تقنية
to have a technical
إلى حد كبير ولكن
reconciliation
غابت روحها
where the
التي كان
spirit
يمكن بطبيعة الحال أن
of reconciliation, however, was absent.
وتقوي من
And
إمكانيات
this,
نجاحها.
unfortunately, would have
إذا توقفنا عند الكثير من
allowed it to
التجارب
be
مثلا
successful.
سنرى
If we take
بأن
other
مسألة
experiences, the question
أيضا
of
البوح بكل الأفعال التي
pardon
ارتكبها
and the question of confession of all problems
مدخلا أساسيا
represented
لنجاح
a
مشروع العدالة
key
الانتقالية على جنوب
entry
إفريقيا مثلا
for the cases of reconciliation in South Africa, which is one of the experiences that could have represented an example for the Moroccan experience. Here, the absence of this recognition on the part of the perpetrators did not make it possible for victims to feel that they were given that the wrong done to them was redressed, and therefore Jacques Derrida says that from the very moment when there is confession and avowal, confession, the perpetrator is no longer criminal, but rather someone better. Here, we do not pardon the criminal as a criminal, but we pardon him and forgive him, considering that he is now a new person. And this is perhaps what pushed Ricoeur to ask the question: can we forgive someone who does not recognize their sin or confess their sin? The question of prescription on which the Moroccan experience focused, and the one that led to the demolition of many truths, tragic truths in many parts of the kingdom, made the question of pardon eventually a very difficult step. Recognition or confession here focused on the necessity of accepting and respecting the agreements that were predefined. Therefore, compensation in this sense has become a technical question to a large extreme. When we go back to the bylaws of this commission, you could see that the unveiling of truth was based on the definition of the responsibilities of the state. However, the state recognized its committing of this crime. However, it did not go beyond that. The refusal of many of the state bodies to present their own testimonies has brought the work back to zero. The meetings taken by the body, the commission, and many state bodies, most of the time confidential spaces, put these bodies in total secure context from any form of questioning and accountability. They avoided to have public hearings on the violations to avoid attacking the power of the state. And indeed, this meant that the truth produced by the Commission an agreement-based outcome that supports
لنظام الحكم في المغرب. لذلك
rotation of
المصالحة
power
مرة
in
أخرى
Morocco.
دائما ما لا يتحكم فيه الحقوقي
is not something that is under the control of defenders of human rights or the Commission or any other parties. Rather, it is something that is controlled and monitored by other parties behind the cloth. Also, the Commission has been flawed by its lack of investment or psychological investment in the experience that took place under or in the context of psychological preparation of the victims, which was extremely selective. Even at this level, the parties concerned by reconciliation and fairness have therefore bet on psychological investment in their victims. This led to feelings of compassion of these people, and they did not have a feeling of being any wrong done to them now being redressed. This was counterproductive because there was feeling of compassion, and eventually it did not lead to any form of integration. The project of integrating these parties failed, and this is what we can see in many of the narratives that underline their writing, more than 30 works, that is called the literature of prison. Here I'm quoting one phraseology from Mohamed Rais, one of the inmates of the prison of Tismarao. He said, "I have become a primitive man," where this psychological reparation was not complete. And it was not meant to be so unless there was confession and recognition, as was already expressed by many of the victims. So here, recognition is a sine qua non condition to go beyond the fighting and the conflict, and to show the individual identity.
أو الإقرار كما يتحدث عن ذلك هونيت الإقرار بمواهب وقدرات الضحايا وإعادة إدماج الجيل. إذن هذه العلاقات التداوتية في عملية الإدماج كانت إلى حد كبير بعيدة كل البعد عن التجربة المغربية في نهاية المطاف. كذلك ما يعاب أيضا على هذه التجربة في كثير من الأحيان، وهذا ربما ما قوى ما يحضر في التجربة التونسية وما يعطيها في نهاية المطاف قوة.
By many other points, unlike the Tunisian experience, which was particularly strong there, is that the Commission did not address
يعني صبر آثار هذه التجربة وجلسات الاستماع على الرأي العمومي كذلك، على الرأي العمومي كذلك.
Basing its conclusions on public opinions. Perhaps this is something you can find in the IVD, Truth and Dignity Commission, and this is something key because it is part and parcel of social integration, but also of psychological integration, because this would have led debate to include the mechanisms of integration ويوصل إلى مستوى التطبيع مع هذه الذاكرة الأليمة وهذه الذاكرة المجروحة في إطار نقاش يستثمر في مسألة تداول النقاش العمومي ولما لا الدفع به قدما لكي يصبح مادة مدرسة بمعنى أنه ينتقل إلى مستوى من مستوى تاريخ أو روايات إلى مستوى ذاكرة بيداغوجية سواء فيما يتعلق بتدريسها أو حتى فيما يتعلق بتأهيل الأماكن التي كانت تمثل سجنا أو تمثل يعني مجال وافتحها في وجوه بطبيعة الحال الزوار. التجربة حتى في هذا المستوى مع هيئة الحقيقة والمصالحة شددت عليها كثيرا، ولكن على مستوى التفعيل ظلت ناقصة إلى أبعد الحدود. إذن المسألة الأخرى أيضا هو أنه في كثير
من الأحيان لم يتم استثمار المحكي. وهذا كانت مسألة أساسية.
There was no investment of what has been said. So the purpose behind the hearing was just technical. It was just like a routine activity, just to take just care of the victims. But with reference to Jean La Couture, so there must be a kind of forgetfulness of the past, and also using or investing in this past. So all these just gaps made the experience with limited perspectives, and it has been governed by the political orientations and challenges, and within a philosophy which was complete and which just a kind of a release for the victims and the executioners. Sorry for the interruption. Mr. Chafik presented some indicators concerning the incompleteness of the Moroccan experience. You know that so it has been characterized by political so there was a movement from one king to the other, and this kind of pragmatism is somehow to inject certain doses in the political life and return the page of violations. It was like kind of a transaction of reparation or material reparation, and with just somehow keeping the truth in obscure just areas. So his questions are mainly about just some questions concerning the duality of forgetfulness and forgiveness. Can we talk about forgiveness as a coercive, let's say, forgiveness, and whether just remembering the details of the past can be a kind of a nightmare that puts pressures on the present and affects the future. So we also talked about the background of recognition. So the victims, they feel somehow a kind of just disregard, and this leads us to just George Herbert, who just relates to human individuals. They just tend to just recognition and recognition of the agent I, and which is just an indicator or criteria for reaching what is called by Onet as the historical freedom. So let me open now the room for discussion. So I will just get 5 or 6 interventions, and maybe we'll open a new list if possible. Mr. Mohammed. Priority is given to those who do not intervene in the previous sessions. Mr. Faraj. We will have a second list, God willing. So let's listen to the questions. So the floor is yours, Mr. Mohamed Benis. Thank you, Mr. Hamada. So I have some in relation to the intervention of my colleagues. So in relation to the Moroccan experience, so we have the epistemological just space or distance just to look at this experience. So the political system in Morocco succeeded in just setting the transitional justice within, democratic transition. And here we need, the authority or the commission has been established in 2004. However, the context started in 1992. So as a result of the procedures in 1994 about just releasing detainees and also some reconciliations which led to the government of just transfer of power, and there was a change of power balance, and so just after the return on the democratic process that was represented by the nomination of the Jiddu government. So the Moroccan experience was not supported by a real democratic transition. The second point is that so in the democratic transition, and we have many examples, so when the coalition of victims, they managed to just get away from the instances or associations, they can be successful. So in Morocco, most of the victims, they were just subject to the domination of parties which did not provide them, just give them the opportunities for just challenging the government with its demands. Mr. Faraj Matour, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Well, thank the presenters. And they somehow dived deep in what happened in Morocco. So I have 2 points to make and 2 questions. So the first point is, to what extent, especially in relation to the writing of history, let's say, do historians have the methodology to make them able to write what happened in somehow in which we keep a distance from what happened? So that's the first question to Mr. Said Haji and Mr. Chafik Abdelghani. And another point, which I think that Mr. Chafik Abdelghani talked about an experience in South Africa, and with the distance that we have, we see that this experience was excellent, and there was not a kind of just risks. So that experience was successful. But if we think how large number of black people, they were just angry at the approach made by Nelson Mandela, and this kept them, many of them, angry because they wanted just to get revenge and to just let's say displace all blacks from all whites from South Africa. So this is to Mohamed Saadi. So you talked about let's say an excellent person. You talked about just the leader, and many historians maybe do not know what happened in that region and the Republic of Rif, which extended over a period of 5-6 years, and he just had a struggle against two, let's say, colonizing authorities. He was fighting against France and against Spain. So we have an anecdote by Yasser Arafat. So he was talking to Mao Zedong, and he said to him that we just our approach is the popular war, as you just did that as our leader, but I But he said that, Mao said that I learned this just kind of popular war from El-Khattabi. So I have a question.
وقرأنا كلنا الكثير من الأشياء. طبعا هو بدأ حراك ذي صبغة اجتماعية، تهميش منطقة مهمشة إلى آخره، ولكن اكتسى أيضا مطلب هوياتي إلى آخره. يعني أتساءل.
It had some identity claims, talking about the Iraq in Morocco. Yeah, but we don't have any figures on the number of persons that were involved in these identity claims. There is also the question relating to the Kabylie region in Algeria. Is there any harmony between what is claimed in the Kabylia and Sousse and other regions in Algeria? Hela Lahbib, journalist from La Presse, which is a political newspaper, concerned by transitional justice and by comparative experiences. I have some questions addressed to all the professors that took the floor in this afternoon session. Now, as regards exclusion and marginalization in Al-Hirak, is it cultural? Is it the exclusion of identity? And is it followed by an economic development exclusion? Besides, do the countryside people, do they ask for, are they separationist? Is there any separation claims and call from the central state? Again, what is the language of Al-Rif, or of this countryside? Because is it Amazigh? As far as I know, Amazigh is now taught in schools and at universities. As regards transitional justice in Morocco, we know that it started with the death of one king and with the coming to power of another king. So there was some change as regards the management of the kingdom, a new orientation. Now, as regards the transitional justice, or what is called the Commission of Equity, is there any historical ceiling, let's say, or is it simply allowed to go back to whatever period it wants? One final question for the historians. Let me say that the time for historians is not the one taken into account by fact-finders and for investigators. It takes them much more to come to truths. I just want to interact with Mr. Saadi as regards Al-Hirak that obviously witnessed a strong call for memory and identity. Now, as regards memory, there is what we call the presence of the Al-Khattabi, who is the flagship of Al-Khattabi, and a Rif flag also. And this Hirak has been described as separationist. How does the professor explain the presence of these symbols in the countryside in the total absence of national symbols? Many scholars think that the Al-Hirak, the question of belonging to the tribal belonging, is extremely strong there, and obviously we all know that tribal discourse is pre-state discourse. Can you ask the gentleman to switch off the mic, please? The other gentleman. Any mic that is not used, can you please switch it off? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for all the speakers. My name is Mohamed Saadi. I am doctoral student in economic sciences and expert in transparency and local governance. But I would like to take some time because the questions are extremely important. I wanted to ask Mr. Mohamed Saadi some direct questions when he insisted on non-forgetting and the enshrinement of rural memory. On the other side, is there any insistence on not violating the rights of the victims by the government in power? Do you think that this movement could be considered, is rightly or not rightly considered as a movement that requires harassment and muzzling on the part of the state? There's a question also as regards objectivity in writing history. Who writes history? Well, the party, the strong people, and the ones that are predominant are the ones who write history. So how can Al-Rif citizens contribute to the writing of this history? Next question. And last. No, please, not last. I wish everybody could take 2 questions. Who decides the conditions of investigation and fact-finding for the Commission? Last 2 questions to Mr. Chafik Abdelghani. And before this, Mr. Said Haji talked about the transitional justice law in Tunisia, and he said that the concept of history was not drafted in Tunisian law. Let me say that the period extending, or that is covered by transitional justice is from 55 to December 2013. And there is also an article that concerns National Archive that is entrusted with collecting all of these documents with their content. This National Archive is the first archive that is entrusted with what represents national memory. Very brief questions. You talked about the intermingling of the social and the political. But here, does it mean, do you mean by political, unlawful and inhuman? When you say that nobody has total truth, now, in this case, can we talk about the relativity of reconciliation, of fact-finding, of truth, and of everything? Just 1 minute for each of the speakers. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I totally agree with Mr. Mohamed.
فيما يتعلق بقضية تكتلات الضحايا أتفق معك إلى أبعد الحدود.
Yes, I totally agree with you, because this question was used and abused not only by the state but also by the political parties, especially as many of those who were part of consensual rotation considered that this was an achievement, and they considered that it was owing to them that its basis was let down. Following this, there was an extreme polarization as regards the victims that weakened any pressure group formation.
أعتقد أنني لما تحدثت عن تجربة جنوب إفريقيا بالنسبة للأستاذ فرج معتوق لم أكن أقصد استنساخ التجربة ما من شيء في أن هذه التجربة اعترتها أيضا بعض الهفوات ولكن هنالك بعض مصادر قوتها التي كان يمكن بالنسبة للتجربة المغربية أن تقتفي أثرها
dimensions that could perhaps be replicated in the Moroccan experience, especially when it comes to recognition, to pardon, and to hearing of victims. Because at this level precisely, this was conducted on a selective basis. You have evoked in your presentation the question of psychological exploitation of victims in Moroccan experience.
يعني لما تدفع هيئة الإنصاف والمصالحة
The commission has not pushed in any psychological preparation for the victims, unlike the South African experience. For the political and human rights dimension, I never thought or said that the political was not lawful. What I meant was that this project was predefined by the political players, and I'm talking here about the state. Therefore, this weakened the outcomes. Now, as regards the relativeness of truth and faith, this is something evident for all of us.
تدخلات بعض الإخوة المتدخلين بالنسبة لمسألة امتلاك المؤرخ للأدوات.
As regards the possession of the historian of the tools, for instance, oral tales. The report said that these tales were contradictory in such a way that it was impossible to make use of them for any accuracy, accurate truth. And therefore, there were some rules that were set as regards processing of oral tales, oral traditions. So there is no real knowledge of this tool as showed afterwards. Among such tools, there was the question of distance. In addition to the historical distance, there is today what we call the methodological distance, meaning time is not enough. You still have involvement on the part of the historian, but there is what we call, as I said, methodological distance that allows us to deal accurately and scientifically with information. The question of IVD, of the Commission of Truth and Dignity, I think the terminology in its bylaws has been distinguished by the fact of not referring to historical dimension, and bylaws have to be written in as accurate terms as possible in order to reach the objectives. Now, Mr. Mohamed, thanks for all the speakers for their interaction and positive criticism. I made a very serious mistake when I said Mohsen Fikri was killed on the 28th of October in 2016 and not 2014. Now, to react to your questions. The question relating to the historian and distance. With all due respect to my colleagues, here we have movements in the Arab world, in the Arab region, that must not be lost. I am for not talking today about Iraq, but rather listening to the pulse of society, to the streets. Sociologists should get down to the streets and to listen to people and not talk about them, because distance makes a number of things, makes us lose a number of things. I totally go for listening to the pulse of the street, to people's claims, and not to set any distance, and not to go back and recollect all this in tranquility. The question of identity claims and the reef, or the countryside. The Hirak started in in two very small cities, not extending 100,000. Yet there was identical mobilization that was extremely strong and that found a very important echo in the diaspora in Brussels and Spain, etc. And the cruel security approach, stupid approach I have to say, gave even more power to Al-Hirak, considering the number of people that got arrested. There was a very important paradox, actually. On the day when Arif people were expecting solidarity to come from Atlas and Amazigh, it was paradoxically coming from other places. And indeed, this destabilized their claims. Indeed, the support came from Casablanca. So this simply turned up and down all of their expectations. Exclusion, yes, exclusion was social, but also identity-based. The whole region was faced with marginalization from the 1950s. The language, yes, there is recognition of Amazigh in the constitution, but this is only the beginning. Our mothers outside one city, they cannot even go from one street to another. Separationism, most of the activists have nothing to do with separationism. There is a small faction, especially outside Morocco, that had the representation of what they call the Republic of Arif. But this is not possible, and this has nothing to do with reality. Most of the activists believe that this is part and parcel of Morocco. Thank you very much. Now, we didn't have the national flag. We had the Republic flag, Tamazgha, and the pictures of Abdelkarim Khattabi, and not the national flag. I say, when we had students' protests, were there any national flag? The ultras in the stadium, do they raise the national flag? No. So please, more than this, when you have the national flag raised by a group of people, it is to scare citizens, scare them off, and therefore people have the right not to raise them. Thank you, Professor Mohamed, and thank you all for your interaction. I would like to thank the speakers. Thank you very much.